Well, good evening, everybody. We are finally getting ready to kick off our Jeff. I guess we can call this the pilot edition, right? Of What's Your Story, CEO edition here, and you're in for a treat. This is going to be the first of quite a few live streams. I'm bringing this back for those of you that experienced this during the pandemic. You know what this is about. I invite special guests to come in. And instead of now talking about individuals' entrepreneurial journeys or kind of life journeys in general, we're really taking a dig at what's it like to make a difficult or a nuanced executive decision. So this is going to be very cool because first of all, Jeff is a really amazing guy. As a matter of fact, we're just talking about West Wing, Jeff. We're going to have to, I wish I had the clip to bring it up. I would consider, now Jeff is not going to say this, but I'm going to say it for him. He's not this, and this is why I love that we're starting this off with Jeff first, because he's not a CEO, but he's the guy that helps the CEO makes those CEO decisions. He is the guy. Now, Jeff, how did they say it in Jeff Lyman in West Wing? How did he phrase it?
Yeah, it was, President Bartlett played marvelously by Martin Sheen, and Josh Lyman played by Bradley. Help me out with his last name.
I can't remember his name.
Bradley Whitford.
Whitford, yes.
And Bartlett looked at Josh and said, "You know the difference between you and me, Josh? I want to be the guy. You want to be the person that the guy depends on."
Yeah.
And that pretty much, kind of sums up my career as well. I've always been the guy that others depended on. And it's a very gratifying role.
Yeah. I think that's a great segue, everyone. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you a little bit of Jeff Opperman, his bio, and then we're going to get right into the What's Your Story arc. I'll explain to you what that's all about, and then we're going to dive right in. And Jeff, here's what I think we're going to do for the CEO edition. We're going to start with the midpoint first. So the midpoint is where the difficult decision is going to be. And then we're going to reverse engineer and start then with the backstory and everything that leads up to that point, and then everything that happens after. I think this is going to be great. So for those of you that are out watching, Jeff Opperman, he is a communication executive. He's also an author, a speechwriter, and a coach. And he began his career producing and writing radio news and sports broadcasts in Washington, D.C. So when he later joined the world of corporate communication, he discovered that all of the elements needed for successful internal, executive, and external communication efforts were the same elements that comprise an effective 20-second news story. I love this. This is so good. This is why we, just as an aside here, everyone, why we enjoy writers like Aaron Sorkin, because of the impact of storytelling here. So with this connection here, there's short, clear, direct language that's included. And so as his career evolved, so did his communication philosophy. And I quote, Jeff says, "Successful communication requires giving the audience what it needs so the speaker can get what he or she wants." So today, Jeff is a results-oriented, calm executive who creates winning thought leadership and brand communications, strategic messages, speeches, presentations, and communication programs for successful C-suite executives and also their organizations. And he's worked in the healthcare field. He's worked in higher ed sector. He has worked in financial services, legal, power generation. We need to talk about power generation, Jeff, because I did some work with Siemens Energy, so I'd be interested in some of your thoughts there. Consulting, no doubt, as well as transportation. All of these industries he's worked in, but he's also a published author, an executive coach, and an award-winning video producer. That I did not know. I did not know you're an award-winning video producer, Jeff. That is cool.
You got to have me on more often, Chris, and there'll be all sorts of things that you can discover.
Oh, yeah. This is not going to be the first or the last time. Well, it's the first, but it won't be the last time for sure. All right, everyone. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to walk us through. It's the same story arc. However, this time it's going to be from a C-level perspective. So let me go ahead and share our screen here. And for everyone that can see here, we're going to walk through first the backstory. The backstory is typically what is the who, what, when, where, maybe even the why, how, like setting the scene, giving us some context that will lead to the catalyst of the decision that needs to be made. So for the CEO edition, the catalyst is really going to be what's the catalyst of the problem, or it can be the catalyst of the decision. It all depends on how Jeff frames the midpoint. Okay, because this is live, we're just gonna roll with it, and we're just gonna craft this thing as it goes, and then we'll see what happens. Now, y'all, don't mind my lorem ipsum dolor sit amet placeholder text. That will go away once we're actually typing things out. Then we hit the big event. The big event is typically going to be something that's either euphoric, really amazing, or traumatic. But it's the event that slingshots us to the midpoint, which is the point of no return. This is the point where the decision has to be made, this nuanced executive decision that then, usually in every great story, leads to a crisis. The crisis really begs the question, did I make the right decision? Was the decision right, but did I make it prematurely? It starts to really chip away at the person's confidence. Sometimes maybe not their confidence, perhaps their team. It can be anything, the environment, the context that they're in, where they start to wonder whether or not they actually are making the right moves here. The crisis is then met with the climax. The climax is what you can kind of call the final showdown. Most final showdowns, everyone, is typically between the person and themselves. The climax is where all of the answers that were asked in the crisis are also answered. All right. And then we go from the climax to the realization. The realization, everyone, is like the denouement. Any great movie, as you know, when the dragon is slain, when the princess is rescued, whatever it is, those typical tropes of a traditional, hero movie, it doesn't end there. There's always an "and they lived happily ever after" moment. It doesn't just go to the rolling credits, the closing credits at the end. Why? There needs to be some sense of closure. This is what the realization is about here. What was learned? Did we actually win? If you won or if you lost, what did you learn? And then, speaking of learning, we will then wrap it up with life application here, everyone. So Jeff will give us 3, maybe 5 application principles that we can take away from his executive decision experience. All right. So, Jeff, what we're going to do is we're going to start off with the midpoint. So I'm going to zoom in here. And for those of you that are watching, this is a very fluid stream. Okay. So the production is going to be a little gritty. I hope you guys are ready for it because you're getting it as we see it here. Okay. So, Jeff, go ahead and walk us through. As you can see, I have just a few bullet points, but as you're talking, there are things that I'm going to summarize. I'm going to maybe ask some follow-up questions. What is the decision that had to be made? So we're going to start there, and then we can fill in all of the background information.
Well, sure, Chris. And again, being the guy that the other guy depends on, it wasn't actually my decision. But when you're in this kind of role, you have a tremendous amount of influence and power, and you got to be really, really careful. I'll just tell you a quick story. I remember once earlier in my career, I was waiting for a meeting to start that I was going to be a part of, but the previous meeting was running long. They invited me to come in and sit at the table and just kind of wait it out until they were wrapped up. And they were discussing whether or not so-and-so should take over the department for someone who just left. Mm-hmm. And they discarded that person, and then they went through some other names, and they discarded those people. And, out of boredom, impatience, I don't know what, but I just kind of threw out the only name I could think of. And, the VP looked at me and said, "Yeah, good idea. Glad we got that settled." And on the one hand, I was extremely flattered and full of pride that he had so much faith in, my opinion and my suggestion. Okay. But on the other hand, I'm thinking I could have just screwed up a bunch of careers. So, being in this role, you really kind of have to step outside yourself and give the best advice you can. Okay. But remember why you're giving that advice and what are the reasons for that advice. And obviously just do the best you can. So this is when I say, when you go to your midpoint piece, it wasn't my decision. The decision was made by the executive I worked for that, he was going to leave the family business, and he and his wife were going to go out on their own and create a new business. And he asked me to come along and kind of help him figure it out. Now, this new business, it could have gone in 20 different directions. Conservatively, it could have gone probably in more directions. Okay. And part of being the guy that the other guy depends on is understanding their thought process, understanding how they make decisions, and facilitating a process so that they can reach the best decision for them.
Got it. So we would say then your so then would you consider yourself, I guess, kind of the advisor in this?
You're an advisor. Sometimes you're an advisor. Sometimes you're a consultant. Sometimes you're a coach. Sometimes you're a therapist.
Yeah.
You wear many different hats. And, this is why the communication skills that I developed, and we can get into this during the background piece, my communication skills over the years really come in handy, because a lot of the same skills that it takes to write a good blog post or write a great speech or put together a great videotape, those are the same kinds of decision-making points and the same kind of thought processes you have to go through to help somebody to reach their good decision. You ask a lot of questions. You get them to give the answers. Okay, you challenge them. And then you kind of watch, and it's fascinating because you literally see the wheels turning in their head.
Yeah.
You watch them kind of hone in on what they want. And the important thing in this role is not to put your own agenda out there, not to put your own opinion out there. If it's going to affect you, you've got to do your best to not let your personal feelings kind of enter into the process.
Yeah.
So when you reach that midpoint, after the decision had been made, and in my case, it was, the executive was leaving the business, was going to go out on his own, was going to start his own thing. He didn't know what it was. He asked me to come with him. That began the process of elimination, going through the things he liked, the things he thought he could do well, the things he thought that there would be a market for, and kind of taking all those things and asking the right questions so that he could narrow down his focus and finally land on the direction he wanted to take.
Got it. So here's what we're going to do, because I think that this decision being made by that particular exec, I'm going to actually put that in some of the backstory here. And I know that we kind of put here the role requires you to step outside. So I'm going to leave that there for now. But I'm going to put this in only because it makes sense to see how everything kind of develops and the kind of catalyst that leads now to this right here, which is, and you kind of just started to mention it. So we're gonna break it down in its simplest terms here. You're helping them to go into a very specific direction. The question now is, and this is where the midpoint is going to be, is what was that direction? Because that's where we're going to say you've decided, or this is where you've helped them to make that decision, which then helps us to kind of escalate on the other side or de-escalate on the other side of the story.
Sure. So this particular executive, he came from a healthcare background. He is a doctor. He was the chief medical officer of a large healthcare organization in Miami. The organization had 130 locations around the country. It was a family-owned business. And for a variety of professional and personal reasons, the family was going to step away from the business and let outside people run it. And the chief medical officer and his wife, who is also a doctor and was also an executive in the business, were going to go off and do their own thing. So then you take a look and say, okay, well, what are you interested in doing? Well, he knew he wanted to be in healthcare. He had worked primarily with the elderly in his CMO role, and he knew he wanted to stay with people who were older. But he also had other interests. He is a tremendous speaker. He considers himself, and I do too, to be a real leadership guru. So, at one point he was looking at creating a leadership business. He also was looking at long-term care because of things that were going on in his own family. And he saw that the kind of long-term care that his wife's grandmother was getting, and that offended him. So he was thinking perhaps maybe he could go into some sort of long-term care business. There was also the concept of, as two very highly qualified doctors, doing their own medicine. And then they had an interest in longevity medicine. And this concept of you can live to be a very, very old age and be productive, okay, if you take the steps early enough to set yourself up for success. Things like being part of a community, nutrition, movement, having purpose and goals, having a strong faith. So he had these concepts, and he was thinking that, well, maybe, there's some sort of longevity business here as well. So those were the various options that we kind of had to weed through and get him to a point that allowed him to make the best decision for him and his family. Now,
okay. So here's what I'm going to, sorry,
in the interest of transparency, okay, he had many other people consulting with him, business people, faith leaders, people in the healthcare industry that he had gotten to know and respect. So, he was getting input from a lot of different people, not just me.
Got it. So here's what we're going to do, because we've gotten a mixture. And what I want us to do is, and we'll probably revisit just a little bit of it before getting to this midpoint. And you're probably going to experience me interjecting here and there sometimes just to kind of get us through this story arc. What would you pinpoint as the point of no return, that specific decision? Because I kind of see it building up in the catalyst, right? The experience with his grandmother, and then the longevity medicine idea. What was it that you and the other advisors or execs that he had? What would you say that decision was just before things started to get okay? Now, how do we execute this? Some of the challenges and things like that. If you had to put that into one sentence, let's say, what would that have been? You're telling him kind of like, okay, this is the direction. What was that direction?
Yeah, and this is where you really have to know the people you're working with. And everybody has their own learning style. And so my role, and the role of people like me, is to adapt to that learning style and not push these people in any one particular direction, but let them get there on their own in their own learning style.
Got it.
Okay. For example, this particular executive, he was very much an outside-in thinker. So he would accumulate all this data and all these options. And it's almost like he put them in a big pile in the middle of the room. And then he would get down on the floor and he would start looking at them, and he'd start throwing them out. Okay, this one's not going to work, and this one's not going to work. And by process of elimination, he then gets down to where he needs to be. So in this particular case, the first thing to go from the pile was the leadership business, because the leadership business didn't really think it had legs in terms of the profitability. Okay, it wasn't part of his sort of core purpose. It was sort of a thing he liked to do on the side. So that went first. Then there was the concept of either buying or building an independent living community, and what's the one after the independent living? Well, anyway, there's a stage after independent living.
Yeah.
And they're usually together. Okay, but because of finances or opportunities or whatever it was, okay, we decided that was not going to be the direction he was going to go in. And the more he talked and the more he kind of got into the details, he really kind of focused in on this concept of longevity medicine. And he could then tie together three things that really kind of created a business model. One was longevity medicine, and that included both his expertise as a board certified cardiologist, his wife's expertise as a board certified primary care physician. The second piece of it was the longevity piece, those 5 drivers that I talked about before: purpose, community, nutrition, physical or exercise, plus spiritual. And for that, he had this vision of creating a physical location where people interested in longevity medicine could get all those things in one place. And then because of the longevity medicine piece, well, that would feed the second business. And obviously, nobody goes into this and just says, okay, I'm going to live to be 100 because I'm going to work out and I'm going to eat right. You got to have the medicine piece of this and the medical expertise to get you on the right supplements, get you on the right diet, manage whatever issues you may have, your medical issues. So those pieces then tied together. And then the third piece was the home care. One of the things that always kind of bothered him, and this goes back to his days as chief medical officer of the healthcare organization, was when people need care in their home, basically they were just kind of sitting there waiting to die. And somebody would come in and take your blood pressure, and maybe Meals on Wheels would come by, but people weren't thriving. People weren't living with purpose. People were just kind of watching TV and just waiting to die. And that really, offended him. So the third piece of this was, well, we're going to get them to a certain point, and we're going to get them to be able to live this life with purpose, and they're going to be healthy, and they're going to exercise, and they're going to live a long time. But if they do eventually need home care, it's not going to be your typical home care. It's going to be this higher level of home care where they can continue to live with purpose, continue to be part of a community, and really kind of thrive in their environment.
Okay.
And so that's how he narrowed down the things he wanted to do.
The longevity medicine, which includes those 5 pillars, the higher level home care. I think I'm missing the middle one because I have here the vision of the physical location.
Longevity medicine is just the medical piece of it.
Okay, and then we have those pillars. Purpose.
Then you have those 5 pillars and the entire center where you can go and you can buy a membership and partake in all this.
Got it.
And then the third piece is the higher level of long-term care.
Got it. Okay. All right. So this is good. I think what we have here, Jeff, if I were to kind of break this down, I think what we've got here is, I would say that, and we can continue to work this out with the backstory. We're going to massage this just a little bit, but it starts with the family, or the executive deciding to leave the family business to create a new one. And then we can massage that just a little bit more here. But the catalyst would be, I could be mistaken here, because there's always different ways, different threads that you can put together for a story. But perhaps the catalyst could be the experience with the grandmother.
Well, I think you're right, and I think there's more than one right answer to this.
Yeah, right.
Okay, I think the backstory is this very, very successful family business that started out as a single, medical center in Miami Gardens, Florida, and grew to this behemoth and 130 something locations in, 15 or 16 states. And then for, again, a variety of business and personal reasons, the family decided to step aside. And it wasn't just the chief medical officer and his wife. It was also his brother, who was the CEO,
Mm.
his sister-in-law, who was the chief legal officer and chief culture officer, and it was also their parents who actually started the business. He was a physician in that first Miami Gardens office and grew that business. And eventually the sons went to medical school. The sons joined him. The sons got married. The wives joined him. And this was an ongoing successful business
Mm.
for well over 30 years. And that's the backstory when they got to the point where they said, you know what? For these reasons, both personal and professional and business, we are going to step aside. So then, okay, the comment, we will step aside, that is the catalyst for each of these six family members then having to decide, well, what they want to do next.
Mm. Got it. Got it. So I'm going to remove some of this here because it looks like the stepping aside is the catalyst. So let's go ahead and let's take this piece here. Now I have here the executive family and relatives, but it wasn't everyone, right? It was just those that were running, the family members that were running the business at the time, correct?
Well, there were six family members running the business. That essentially was the family. There are children and grandchildren involved, but
But not all six left to create the new business.
no.
Okay, got it.
Everybody kind of went off and did their own thing. And the chief medical officer and his wife, who I believe her title was the chief clinical officer at the healthcare organization, they went off to do their own thing.
Got it. Okay. So here's what we've got here. And I think this is going to be helpful because let me see if I can just drop this in. Because now we've got two pieces. We've got the personal piece here, of course, with grandmother that was also kind of experiencing some things, but probably the more significant one is just the fact that they decided to leave the family business to create this new one that could help people. Not saying that this is right the storyline, but that could help individuals like their grandmother, right? Once again, we know that it's very nuanced, right? To try to get everything into one story arc.
Sure, Chris. It's like an episode of The West Wing. You've got your main storyline, then you've got your secondary, and even perhaps a third story, all running within that 45 minutes.
The subplots upon subplots, right? And so now for this big event, then I would say that the big event would be what would you say it is then? Because I have here, this idea of longevity medicine, the 5 pillars, the physical location, and vision of having all of this happen in an actual place, and then higher level home care. So the question is, would you say that is the midpoint, or would you say that is the midpoint, or is that the ideas in here, the big event that leads to the midpoint? I guess the midpoint I would put here is decides to leave, like to actually, what would you say?
Well, I think your midpoint is when they decided that this is what they are going to do. We've looked at all the options. We've talked to all our advisors. We've figured out the money piece of this. The midpoint is we have made our decision.
Okay. Now, is there anything before that you can think of? And probably, of course, there are definitely things that you wouldn't be able to disclose that you would consider a big event before or even after, or maybe during, them culling down all of these different options in these different directions to finally saying, okay, this is the direction that we're going. If not, that's okay.
Yeah, I think there is a big event, and I think it had to do with the finances.
Okay.
And again, I was not privy to the family and business finances, but I think money played a role in it. And I think when they finally found out exactly how much they had to work with, that really influenced the direction they went in.
Got it. So
there were things I'm not going to go into where it could have been a very, very big number that they had to work with.
Hmm.
And then obviously on a continuum from a low number to a high number, there were many other numbers along the way. And when they saw it wasn't going to be that really, really big number, and they really kind of pinpointed what they did have to work with, that was the sort of the big event.
Ah, okay. So we've got some massaging here to do, but I think this is good. So I have here, and I know out of everything that you said, Jeff, I just have here succinctly, a successful family healthcare business that's been running for 30 years down here in Miami, Florida. I know that there's probably more that we can do. We'll do that, kind of just shifting some things around. But here now, one of the catalysts is them um, decide. Would you say that they decided to leave, or they were kind of toying with the idea and then they finally made the decision?
Well, I wasn't at the dinner table, so
Yeah,
I can't tell you exactly what the thought process was.
yeah, yeah,
But I do know that it was a very long, thoughtful process
yeah.
to reach that point. They
Mhm,
considered many different things, everything from the financial health of the business to their own personal relationships.
mm,
Obviously, the doctor and his wife who started the business, they were at this point very elderly and not as involved as they once were. So
yeah.
there were many, many things that over a long period of time, they eventually came to the decision that we need to turn this over to a management team.
Mm, okay. Okay. That actually is very helpful as well. Where there are just multiple I'll use the word again because I already wrote it, that led to the strong consideration to you know hand over the leadership or the management. Okay. For their, I guess what we say for their first thing that came to mind was mental health. Businesses can drive you crazy, but no, it would be for their
I
uh
think it's fair to say for their relationships.
okay.
I grew up in a family business, certainly not one of the size of this healthcare organization,
Yeah.
but my grandparents were in business with my father, and my uncle was in the business.
Yeah.
You know, a family business is not an easy thing to do, and the
Mm, mm,
fact that this family did it so successfully for so long,
yeah.
I really got to take my hat off to them because I know the toll it takes on a family when everybody's in business together. You go to Thanksgiving and you're sitting around the table, and you're not just with your family, you're with your business partners.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's really a tough balance.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. This is actually good. This is good. So I'm gonna actually make that the thing here. And then we go from the catalyst to the big event. The big event here would be then as they are narrowing down the directions. So I should probably put that there, right? Narrowing down directions. We have the longevity medicine approach, the 5 pillars that will help their clients. We call them clients or patients? Clients, right?
You call them
Patients,
clients.
clients, to improve and to improve their health, not just physical, but um, spiritual, mental, and then of course it being in a physical location, higher level healthcare actually being part of this this new approach, but the finances is what influence the direction. And we're going to keep that nebulous, right? Because there's a lot of things that we can have around that. But that would be the big event. Now, the question is, I guess this big event seems not necessarily neutral. I mean, euphoric or traumatic, right? I think it's neutral. I don't think it's like a,
Well, to
oh,
be honest with you,
okay.
Chris, it was a little traumatic for me because when he asked me to leave the healthcare organization and come with him and help him figure it out, I was kind of jumping off the cliff without a parachute.
Ah,
There was no
okay.
net. And I had no idea where this was going to lead. So I know,
Yeah,
you got to keep your personal feelings out of it when you want to
right.
play this role. But, from my perspective, the big event was leaving the healthcare company and going off not knowing what the future was going to look like. And
Mm,
I think if you want to extrapolate a little bit, even though they made the decision that they were going to step aside,
yeah.
it kind of had to be a big event for them too, because they were
Mm,
leaving, the only company they ever worked for. It was the
yes.
family business, and they were going to take this step into the unknown, and they didn't know where they were going to end up.
That's good. Let's make that over here then, after the midpoint, crossing that threshold into the new world, we would have what we would consider crisis. Now, it may not be literal crises that have occurred, but let's talk about that. So now they decide to focus on that specific business venture. What happens next?
Well, then everything gets real. It's fun to talk and to strategize and
Yeah.
to bounce ideas off each other and kind of narrow down your options until you land on a decision. But then when it gets real, it's like, oh my God, how do we do this?
Mm, yeah.
And obviously, two very accomplished doctors. They had run a large healthcare organization for many years. They weren't totally in the dark about the
Mm,
things that they had to do and what happens next. But there were huge pieces of this, from the financial to the marketing to the branding to the strategy development, that it's kind of sort of outside of their sandbox, outside of their areas of expertise. And I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but I wouldn't call it a crisis, but it had to be scary.
yeah. Okay. So because their focus, right, was medicine. And so now it's almost as if, and maybe this is probably where we can, how we can kind of frame this, is that they're not new to the business, but they're new to starting up a new one. And
I,
so it's not that they didn't know how to run one. It's, well, how do we actually start one to begin with? Right. Um,
yeah, I
is
think
that,
that's fair. They had a big hand in growing the healthcare organization. I think when they entered the business, it had 5 locations or 7 locations. When they left, it had over 130. Um, and the entire family gets huge amounts of credit for growing that business that way. So they knew what it took to
mm,
grow that business. All right. So some of those skills and some of those learnings were transferable,
yeah.
but they were also getting into areas that they never had to think about before. They always had people working for them, very highly accomplished executives
Yeah.
doing things like HR and strategy development and finance and those kinds of things. And
Mhm.
now they were doing it themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if anything, and I guess we wouldn't call that a crisis, but I think that perhaps, because typically for this specific kind of for this stage, I think maybe the how do we do this is is probably the crisis question. Maybe, right?
Maybe
Um,
crisis isn't the right word, but maybe it's more like panic. You
okay.
know, I
Yeah.
remember, many times when I would go on interviews for speech writing opportunities, the question that always came up was, well, how do you write a speech? How do you start?
Mm,
And I said very honestly, well, the first thing you do is panic, because you figure you're never going to have the time to learn everything you have to learn,
yeah.
to get it the way it needs to be in the time allotted. You're talking about topics that really are just brand new to you.
Yeah.
And as the
Yeah.
speechwriter, you got to figure it out.
Mm,
So you want to extrapolate from that a little bit. Now you're these two people are in an opportunity, in a position where there's a lot of stuff they got to figure out. And
mhm.
so, yeah, late at night when it's just you and your thoughts, it's like there has to be a little bit of panic. Like, do I have what it takes to do this? Do
You
I
took the
have
words
what it takes
right
to
out of my
figure
mouth.
this out?
Yep. Yep. You took the words right out of my mouth. And the reason why I say that, Jeff, is because for this decision is very similar to past storylines that I've done, and that is one of the most quintessential questions: do I have what it takes
Do I have what it takes?
to get this
And
thing? Yeah.
and this is where your positive self-talk kicks in.
Yeah.
And it's like, you know what? I learned how to become a doctor. I learned how to, be a CMO. I learned how to run a business.
Yeah.
I learned how to do, I learned how to ski. I learned how to do all sorts of things. And I can learn how to do this.
Mm,
And it takes a lot of faith and a lot of confidence, and also the ability to know what you don't know. And know in those cases, you got to go ask the right people to help kind of guide you through it. And as long as you can kind of step outside yourself and look at it that way,
yeah.
yeah, you're going to figure it out.
That's good. I love the phrase "figure it out." I used to tell my design students that all the time. When we throw them into a design sprint, in like week 1, week 2, welcome to UX design, and we just throw them right into a sprint, Jeff. And I tell them the industry is looking for figure it out designers, not the ones where you have to always run to your manager or maybe even to a teammate. I say 3 levels of questions that you need to ask. Ask yourself first, whether that's with Google or but ask yourself, like, how do I solve this? Then you can ask a peer, and then you come to one of us, right? Come to one of us as instructors, but kind of follow that practice. I think, Jeff, we have it then. I started writing this as you were talking, but the first one I had before, because we've done this before in some capacity, right? Now what we need to do is ask specific people to help us through this process. In other words, we are not alone. And maybe I should put that here too, is we aren't alone in this. Okay. Now, what we're gonna do is we're gonna land this plane. I know there's probably so much more nuance that we can have here, but realization. What would you say? And this is where sometimes it's the ending hasn't happened yet. Many times, right? So it could still be in process. So this is where we can ask, what were some of the things that might have been learned? Of course, using the word realized. What were some of the wins, if there were any? This is where we kind of put a little bow, if possible, around it. And if not, that's okay. We can keep it open-ended with one of those, thoughtful, sage-like, statements.
Sure. Well, in this particular example that we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes, it is still in process. Mm-hmm. The medical piece of the business is literally, I think, just got off the ground a week ago. The facility they're building for those 5 drivers of longevity is in the process of being built, and I don't think it's going to open until March or April. Okay. The actual piece of the business that has been operating now for a few months is the upgraded home care that they are offering. And I think when you talk about sort of the milestones, obviously I think the first milestone is when you start hiring other people.
Yeah.
Yeah. For that business, you needed sort of like a director of nursing or a director of sales, a director of marketing. When you start hiring other people, okay, for the areas where you are not the functional expert,
yeah,
those are pretty big milestones. That's kind of giving you the realization that, okay, this is really going to happen. And now I just have to be smart enough to stay out of their way so that they can do what I know they can do. Mm. And, much like the example you just gave, they are here for, support, the overall strategy, the guidance. Those are the kinds of things that they could provide when their marketing person is developing the marketing materials, their salesperson is developing the the contacts, the strategy person is developing, the plan.
Yeah.
When the nursing director is going out and hiring home care workers, pretty big milestone, pretty big realization there. And then obviously, as that process continues, you get your first client, your second client, you start to see some revenue roll in. That is the realization that this could work. Or the flip side of that is, if none of those things work the way they're supposed to, maybe we made a mistake. And in this particular example, I don't think they're anywhere near that point of deciding that this is going to be a success or a mistake, because it's far too early in the process. Right. But those are the kinds of milestones you look at.
That's good. So did you mention that the upgraded home care facility is up and running now, or is that?
No, home care is literally you go to the person's home and you provide care. So that is up and running. But the actual facility they're building for the longevity piece of this is still in the process of being built.
Okay. Make a note of that. All right. So Jeff, this is good. What we're going to do is, from everything that you've learned from this experience, what were maybe 3 to 5 life applications that you would extrapolate from this particular decision-making experience?
Well, I could approach this again, going back to the start of our conversation, as the guy that somebody else depends on. And, from that perspective, I really think it's some of the things we touched on before. It's not about you. I basically was in a position where if I did a really, really good job helping him to get to the conclusion he got to, I would consult myself right out of a job. And that's essentially what happened. And believe me, I'm fine with it, because it was the best decision for him. So, taking sort of yourself and your personal stake out of it, I think is a really important point for someone in my role. Now, if you're talking to the executive, it might be a totally different answer. The other sort of takeaway, I think anyone who goes through this process needs to keep in mind is, you got to play the long game. You can't focus so much on the short-term highs and lows, because if you do, they will just drive you absolutely insane. One day you're on top of the world, the next day you think the world is falling apart.
Yeah.
You got to keep the long game in mind, and you got to keep your eye on the ball. Once you really kind of focus in on your purpose, what your goal is, okay, don't get distracted. Okay, don't let some shiny object over here, okay, distract you from the direction you need to move in and the things you have to do. That shiny object may seem like a great idea, okay, but if it's kind of outside the parameters that you've set, you got to ignore it.
Yeah, that's good. You know what? This is great, because so we have remove personal bias when helping execs make important decisions. Play the long game. In other words, think strategically, and then keep your eye on the ball. Don't get distracted in order to successfully follow through with whatever the execution is supposed to be for that decision. I think those are 3 solid ones. What's interesting? I said that this year, Jeff, I said that I was going to use probably one of these phrases quite often. That was, I have a hunch. And I had a hunch, Jeff, that a lot of what we're going to be walking through, just like with yourself and some other execs, these life application principles, even some of the nuances in the storytelling, we will find them in the boardroom, but we can also find them at the kitchen table. And I think that I'm not on a mission to tear down the curtain that's behind the C-level kind of mystique there, but I really do think that it's not going to be as scary in a sense, if that makes sense. Um, as many people might think. More so, I would love for individuals who are, I don't want to call them the average person, but people who don't have to necessarily make high impact decisions, right, on a day to day basis, to realize that they can still take these principles and they can apply it, you know, in a smaller sphere, so to speak. Because I do think that a lot of it is very translatable. So, Jeff, here's what we're going to do. We're going to walk through, by the way, just so that everybody can see, we've kind of mapped everything out. I'm going to read it through, and I'll do my best. I know that there's some things that we could have nuanced a little bit more, but that's okay. That's okay. If anything, Jeff, we'll chat a little bit later, but I think we've got enough here to kind of start off. So with the backstory, there's a successful healthcare, a successful family healthcare business that's been running for 30 years down here in South Florida. And there came a time where, and I got to zoom in because I can't even see it myself. There came a time when multiple factors led to the strong consideration to actually hand over the leadership and the management to preserve their relationships. So here it is, where they're looking at a long-term care business based on their own family experience. One of those experiences included their grandmother, but there are other factors as well that were involved. But the catalyst, the clutch here, is that the executive family team considered leaving the family business to create this new business. And because of that, there's a lot of things that go into that. So they pulled in people like Jeff. They pulled in some other advisors, and they started to narrow down. I know that that's a typo there, but they started to narrow down the directions that they could have gone. And they landed on a few things that made so much sense to them. Focusing on longevity medicine. Obviously, these executives, which I didn't mention before, they are from a medical background. So longevity medicine, the 5 pillars that include their clients focusing on purpose, community, nutrition, movement, and the spiritual aspect or faith. The vision of having a physical location where all of this can take place, and then the inclusion of higher level home care. Big event. Finances actually influence the direction. There are a lot of things that money will just help you to make the most practical decision. And it's not that they, had money to guide everything, but as we all know, in the world that we live in, money definitely does help to help steer the direction. And there are nuances, ones that we won't disclose, that were included in finances being one of the most influential impacts of them deciding the midpoint, which is to focus on the specific venture that wasn't focused in leadership. I didn't put on there, but I think I remember some of it. Leadership. What were the other ones?
Independent living facilities was one.
Yes, ILFs. Yeah, got it. Okay. Got it. So they made this point of no return, but then it begs, and it wasn't necessarily a crisis as much as perhaps it was a crisis question of how do we actually now do this? We made the decision, but do we have what it takes to make this happen? Why? Because we now have had experience growing this business that has been around for 30 plus years, but it's a little bit different from us actually starting one from scratch. There's marketing, there's branding, there's finances, HR, many of the things that are outside of our expertise. So do we actually have what it takes to make this happen? Well, it goes without saying, of course, Jeff and others, especially with the counsel that has been given, can help to remind them that, yeah, you do have what it takes. As a matter of fact, you've done this before in some capacity. And not only that, but you can also ask the right people. You aren't alone in this journey. These individuals are going to be the linchpin to how you can have a successful or run a successful business. Well, the realization is this. They actually did have the capacity to start hiring their team. So you've got the directors of nursing, sales, marketing, areas where they weren't the expert. It seems if we were to dive into this a little bit deeper, not understanding or knowing, I would say, the full nuances of this particular business, but a lot of them tend to have certain challenges. And maybe one of the biggest challenges was realizing that there is a particular lane. Even though you may have the vision, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'd be in charge of the execution. And so upgraded home care is up and running now. So kudos to the startup that is doing this, and the facility is also currently being built. Now, here's the thing, everyone, that Jeff has extrapolated from I know it may sound super simple, but this was a very nuanced experience here. The first one is to remove personal bias, especially when you're helping execs make important decisions. That might even mean that you consult yourself out of a business. The next one is to play the long game. You have to think strategically. And one of the ways that you can stay on that strategic path is the last principle that Jeff leaves us with, which is to keep your eye on the ball. Don't get distracted.
And Chris, if I could add one more to that.
Yes, please.
And that was a great recap. But if I could add one more application, again, if you are in a role like I was in, you have to listen. You have to listen. You know, there's that old expression that we were born with 2 ears and 1 mouth, and that means we should listen twice as much as we talk. And if you are going to be the coach or the consultant or whatever you want to call this role, okay, you really, really have to listen, and then target your feedback on what was said. And to some extent also, you know, you could target your feedback on what wasn't said. But that's a whole other hour-long conversation.
We got to come back for that. Actually, I'm putting that as number 5. Target the feedback on what was and wasn't said. That is where especially emotional intelligence comes into play. You know?
Yeah, and just very briefly, I know we're running short on time, but there's 2 kinds of communication out there. One is called content. That is what is said, what you read, what you hear. And the other is process, you know, how the message was delivered. And if the message was delivered in a process that raises red flags, well, that's telling you something that wasn't spoken.
That's good.
So that's why you gotta listen, and that's why you gotta pay attention to both, you know, what is said and how it was said.
Yeah, Jeff, this was great. Now, before we go, gonna put you on the spot here, and it's okay if you don't have someone in mind, but who do you think would be a great C-level leader to take on this What's Your Story experience?
I actually have thought of somebody, and I have not run this by him. I don't know if he'll even pick up the phone if you call, but there's a guy by the name of Mark Dickinson, who is the brand new CEO of the New York region of AAA. And he comes from a marketing background. His family has a nonprofit that is doing very, very well. And as a brand new CEO, I don't know if he'll have the time, but I think his insights into the role would probably be very valuable for you and your listeners.
Yeah, you know, I think it's such a small world. I think if it's the same Dickinson we're thinking about, I think I helped them with their wearable tech startup that they have.
That's right.
The same one. Okay.
Yes.
Small world.
You did.
Wow. Look at that. Look at that. All right. Well, listen, that's great. You know, serendipity. I love it. Jeff, this was great. First of all, I want to thank you so much for your transparency. You were able to take a very complex, sophisticated situation, while, you know, keeping things still anonymized, you know, to an extent, to be able to fully share your story. That's, by the way, everyone, that's not easy to do. It's not easy to be able to take a story, to explain it in detail while still protecting, in a sense, those that are involved, so that you can still have enough that somebody can listen to and to extrapolate, like we just did here, lessons and some of the finer nuances of what's happening without divulging everything. This could be a masterclass. Actually, Jeff, we might have to. This could be a masterclass in learning how to share business without telling all the business. but
I'm
Jeff,
happy to come back anytime, Chris.
for sure. All right, everyone. This is our first episode. It's one and done. We're out, and we'll see you guys in the next one.